But there's a lot to unpack as far as our relevance within BRICS, how BRICS is going to be going and changing in the not too distant future. It's all about relations. It's all about growing the economy. Top of the agenda, yes, they had the discussions around electricity and agreements with Chinese companies. But it was over 60 countries, remember, that descended on Sanson not too long ago for that 15th edition. One of the big talking points was, without a doubt, the expansion of the BRICS bloc. So right now it's the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's being pushed up to 11 countries. So it's going to be a much longer acronym. I don't even know what the acronym is going to be at this point. But let's get the thoughts of Gustavo de Carvalho making time for us from the SA Institute of International Affairs. Gustavo, good to have you back on eNCA. Here's my concern. We add more countries to the mix and we dilute our relevance. We're already bottom of the pile in the current 5. Now we bring in countries with much higher GDPs, much better economies. I think we could get forgotten about. Good morning. You agree or disagree?
Good morning, Gareth, and thank you very much for having me. And I think there is certainly a risk that we have for BRICS at this particular stage when we see the expansion of BRICS to 11 countries now, and particularly the types of countries that came. I think the sizes of the economies in a way matters, but I don't think is the most important one. I think there is a particular type of important commodity producers, and especially oil producers from the Middle East. But to a certain extent, I think it all depends on what member states will be doing. I think there is still needs to be done to achieve what BRICS can actually do. We're going to have a very important discussion in the next year regarding the use of local currencies. But we need to see that in the last 15 years, BRICS hasn't really been utilized as a trading bloc. So issues around tariffs, around infrastructure for trade, all of those will be essential if we would like to see the success of BRICS. But particularly for the group itself, and I think some definitions regarding how decision-making will be affected by this expansion is still quite unclear, both in terms of what were the criteria that enable countries to join, but it's even more unclear at this stage what will be the impact on the overall decisions that traditionally are done via consensus by its members.
So now, if you were to take a look at the kind of relationship that we now have, Gustavo, with those countries that are coming in as well, it's one thing to say, welcome to Sunday lunch, let's just invite some more neighbors in for a bite to eat from 5 through to 11. I want to focus on Africa, on South Africa, because right now we've been the creme de la creme for the African continent. But what is our relationship, just on our own, if you isolate us, in relation to those new countries? Do we benefit? Do they benefit? Who's getting the free lunch here?
There is a potential in there. And I think when we look into the motivations that President Ramaphosa has been presenting in the last couple of months, it's all about integration within the African continent. We are in the middle of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, potentially a game changer for the continent, but our economies are still very far from being very complementary to one another. But when we look into countries like Egypt and Ethiopia that have recently joined or will be joining BRICS on January 1st, 2024, they bring some of that potential, and I think they can all become stronger champions around that. I think the idea of being this small exclusive group of emerging economies comes against many of the demands of BRICS itself, particularly when the concerns around the role of the G7 and the disproportionately high role that G7 countries have in global governance issues. So I think it can be an important aspect, and I think there is 3 parallel processes that we need to look into for the continent. First, the expansion of BRICS and what we will do in terms of those Middle Easterns or those countries around the Middle East, and I think there is certainly a preference around that. But also the implementation of the African Free Trade Area, and we shouldn't forget this month now, in September already, there will be the G20 summit, where there is an expectation of a potential ascension of the African Union into that. Yeah. So for a country like South Africa, it's important not to necessarily develop isolated aspects of its foreign policy, but really to develop mechanisms that integrate those and create benefits for South Africa and for the continent as a whole.
Give me a sense, Gustavo, as I start saying goodbye to you, because I'm glad you mentioned G20. It's where we're going to next. It's going to be the next big focus point as well. Do you buy the angle that if you are a member of BRICS, you are anti-West, you are anti-AGOA, or do you think you can sit in the middle? Can you fence sit as a country in this? Can you be part of AGOA and be part of BRICS and do so equally? Or do you always think we're going to take a slant to one way or the other? Is it possible to be 100% neutral?
The issue of neutrality is a complicated one, and I think I like to see the issue more in terms of what provides you autonomy of action internationally. If we're looking to the membership of BRICS, including the new countries that have joined, there is varied relations with the West, where countries like Brazil, like South Africa, like India, even Saudi Arabia and UAE, all of them have very positive relations with the West as well. I think we are in a space where globalization has been heavily questioned by many, including those in the global north. If we look into the challenges between the United States and China when it comes to trade, when it comes to semiconductor supply chain. So I think to a certain extent, it will be interesting to see whether BRICS is going to continue with an approach that we've become accustomed to, that is a group that agrees to disagree. It's not a group that tends to have a lot of issues in common, and they tend to very narrowly focus on those. Of course, we have countries like Iran with a very complex and complicated relation with the West, and how that will impact in terms of the narratives. But I don't think in principle we should see BRICS precisely as an anti-West alliance. First of all, it's not an alliance itself. I think it's a narrow grouping with very specific objectives and targets. And to a certain extent, countries like South Africa have not only the opportunity, but the responsibility to ensure, like countries like India, that its relationships with Western countries and non-Western countries are not necessarily a zero-sum game. There is a space where it can provide a win-win, but it's a really tight line that we're walking through now. So narratives are important, having clearer positions are important, and I think the processes that we've seen from South Africa in the last couple of months to provide a slightly more clear foreign policy than what we saw in 2022 is important to continue strengthening that if we are to be taken seriously in the global stage.
And I feel like you and I are going to be talking again here on eNCA ahead of that G20 summit, during the summit and after the summit as well. Gustavo, always good to have you with us. Gustavo de Carvalho joining us from the SA Institute of International Affairs.